In the early hours on Thursday, October 10th, 2024, Hurricane Milton made its way through central Florida, bringing 86-mile-per-hour wind gusts and torrential rain to the Orlando area. The forecast for this major storm prompted Disney to temporarily close the Walt Disney World theme parks for just the 13th time in the resort's 53-year history. Now, following the hurricane, Walt Disney World's theme parks have reopened, and this weekend, the Typhoon Lagoon Water Park and Fort Wilderness Campground will reopen as well. We had viewers of this channel who weathered the storm on site and sent in photos. This is our post-hurricane Walt Disney World damage report. At the outset, it should be said, this hurricane, which was shaping up to be one of the worst that Walt Disney World has ever had to sustain at the time of our last broadcast, thankfully did not live up to the forecast, predicting winds in excess of 110 miles per hour possible for the Orlando area. However, on the approach to Florida on Wednesday afternoon, the hurricane spawned some horrific tornadoes in South Florida. Walt Disney World itself was under tornado warnings in the mid-afternoon, which is quite rare to see. With the storm on approach, Disney battened down the hatches across their parks. On Wednesday, we saw many of the hanging signs around the parks get roped up so they couldn't fly away, and the same was done with many of the hanging light fixtures as well. Point of sale systems at Epcot that are outside, they were covered in waterproofing to prevent water damage. A similar strategy was employed with the Magic Band touch points you have outside of the attractions where people scan in to get in the Lightning Lane queue. Banners around the parks, they were removed as well. Over at Disney's Contemporary Resort, Disney parked 2 of their monorails inside the hotel for the duration of the storm and closed the cutouts in the building that the monorails normally head through, which was a smart move there, keeping the monorails and the hotel well shielded from the elements. Most interesting was Disney strapping down their carts around the theme parks with these yellow nylon straps, and the ends, they were drilled right into guest pathway, which is not something you see Disney do every day, damaging their own pathways, putting holes in them like that. Viral on social media was a home in Florida where the homeowner employed the same idea Disney put to use here at their parks, which I don't think I've ever seen done before. It's very interesting, and it looks like it ended up working quite effectively for both that house as well as for Walt Disney World. As the storm inched closer, Disney really started taking this seriously. They got everything strapped down, they zip-tied the umbrellas that they have all over the parks, they removed canvas from many of the outdoor covered structures they have. On their website Wednesday, Disney removed the language we covered in our last video where they suggested they'd likely be closed on Thursday. It sort of seemed up in the air. They said maybe we'll open Disney Springs, and they strengthened their statement to say we will be closed on Thursday. By 8 p.m. on Wednesday, Disney was instructing guests to begin sheltering indoors. As the hurricane made landfall on the Gulf Coast, it brought flooding and extremely powerful winds to areas including Sarasota, Fort Myers, and St. Petersburg. In St. Pete, a crane fell. You probably saw what happened to the roof over at the Tropicana Field over there. However, where our area of focus is concerned, Orlando, the predictions many meteorologists made where we'd see the hurricane start rapidly de-intensifying as it made its way towards land, that ended up coming to fruition. The over 100-mile-per-hour wind gusts reported on the Gulf Coast dropped a decent bit by the time the storm made it to Central Florida during the 1 a.m. hour on Thursday. However, the 86-mile-per-hour wind gusts that Walt Disney World saw, those are no joke. Those are some of the highest wind gusts ever recorded in Orlando since Walt Disney World was built. These winds were up there with what we saw with Hurricane Irma back in 2017, where the highest recorded wind gust at Disney's Contemporary Resort was 91 miles per hour. During the storm, Park Pass TV had a stream up on YouTube showing views of Epcot from the Swan and Dolphin area throughout the storm. And you can see, even though the park had closed at 2 p.m. that day on Wednesday, the beacons of magic animated lights that you have on Spaceship Earth, they continued that night throughout the night without a hitch throughout the storm, and they were actually lighting up the sky a little bit throughout this storm, which made for some pretty incredible views, as you can sort of see the gusts of wind and rain and clouds going by in the area. Just a crazy scene here. Guests that were on property that night captured some incredible audio from inside the hotels during the worst of the storm. Listen to this. Just crazy, man. While the wind continued howling, people were spotted milling around outside, which is pretty interesting there. And especially once the rain and wind died down, more and more guests ventured out of their rooms to capture the moment. As the sun rose on Thursday morning, the day the parks were closed, it was shaping up to be a resort hotel hangout kind of day. You can see the resort hotels had some very minor flooding going on in some areas, and there were a lot of debris from nearby trees and other vegetation that got kicked up by the wind. Disney's horticulture teams got quickly to work, blowing the bits of tree off the guest pathways and getting things back to looking how they should. However, we started to discover some areas received damage where the fixing up is going to be a bit more involved. For one, right outside of Walt Disney World, just north in Horizon West, that neighborhood where many cast members and content creators live, you can see some trees were ripped out of the ground, which really gives you an idea of the winds here. Similar things were also seen in Celebration, the residential area Disney built. Getting into the damage at Walt Disney World, over at Disney's Polynesian Village Resort, a large section of one of the roofs covering the guest rooms got blown onto the upper part of the longhouse as the heavy wind got caught under the soffit there and then ripped the lower part of the roof straight off of the rafters, which is quite impressive there. These winds were really powerful. Additionally, another longhouse suffered some similar but less total damage to its roof as well. Over at Disney's Grand Floridian Resort and Spa, we posted on our site in our reports the day this happened, you can see some shingles flew off of the hotel. I was saying on Twitter, Disney's gonna get those door knockers saying, we'd like to do a free roof assessment. It'll be covered by your insurance. Let us take a look at your roof. You need up-to-date reports. I think we see something going on your roof there. Over in the Epcot resort area, where many of the guests who were on site at Walt Disney World that night, that was the area they were staying, there were a lot of downed trees near the boardwalk area. Some of the trees that snapped and fell over, they snapped light fixtures as they went down as well. In other areas, the light fixtures just seemed to crumple on their own, which probably suggests there was some flying debris that was impacting some of these light fixtures. Over at Disney's Caribbean Beach, that hotel, some of the siding was ripped off the building by those 86-mile-per-hour wind gusts as they got in between the decorative exterior and the building itself and just blew parts right off of it. More minor flooding was visible at the Swan and Dolphin, where it looked like the fountain became a little larger here, a little bit hard to see there. And in particular, over on World Drive, which is that main road you take to get to the Magic Kingdom area, it likely was completely flooded after the storm. However, by the time guests were driving down that road the next day, Disney had already set up pumps on site where they were well into removing the excess water that had built up on the road. They were really on top of it here. Speaking of roads, some of those beautiful Walt Disney World road signs bid adieu during the storm. On the flooding situation, with the massive amount of rain Orlando saw, guest rooms on and off property, we saw in reports on social media they had water leaking under the doors, the sliding doors, and we also had reports from guests that some of the ground level rooms at Disney's Polynesian had flooded during the evening. And the next day there were all sorts of blow dryers and things that they were doing to try to circulate some of that moisture out of the buildings. Back to the wind damage, of course, with all the cool theming Disney has around the resort, there's a lot of vinyl and canvas and things like that, which did not fare too well during this storm. Interesting, at the boardwalk, some fabric ripped and then got caught up into a light above it, and Disney had crews on site that quickly fixed that. However, later in the day on Thursday, I believe that same piece got caught up again. I guess it blew up again and got caught on another light, so Disney's still working through some of this here. While Disney's horticulture teams broke out chainsaws to remove fallen trees and branches throughout the 43 square mile resort, Disney had resort guests and fuzzy friends being entertained by Pluto and other walk-around characters at the resorts, which was very nice to see there. Other special accommodations for guests that were stuck at the resorts included making the arcade machines free for the day, discounts on puzzles and board games, and strangest perhaps was the best deal that I think we've seen at Disney since Chapek first rolled onto the scene. Here we have $10 for a bag containing a whole grocery store-sized jar of jelly and a jar of peanut butter and bread and knives and napkins. I don't know what gave them that idea for a hurricane to set that up, but pretty cool there. Over at Disney's Coronado Springs, that hotel, guests noticed that one of the themed doors that normally stands partially ajar, it had actually been blown off of its hinges onto the ground, which is another example of showing how powerful these winds were. Over at the Yacht and Beach Club, back over at the Epcot area, there were lots of little bits of debris and things like that, but the ground stood up pretty well, considering they were up against an hour or so of peak 86 mile per hour wind gusts. And while animals began returning to the savannah at Disney's Animal Kingdom Lodge Hotel in the afternoon following the storm, which was great to see, at that point, we still weren't sure how the theme parks fared. And a lot of guests were asking me, how is Fort Wilderness doing? How's the Magic Kingdom doing? On Friday morning, the parks resumed normal operations. Disney's 4 theme parks reopened to guests. At that point, Disney had completed their preliminary hurricane damage assessment. And what visitors of the parks observed was the parks looked great for the most part. It looks like we're just about back to normal here. It was clear the day prior when the parks were closed that there were definitely some trees that had fallen in the parks and were blocking guest pathways. And during that day of closure, it gave Disney teams the opportunity to be able to cut those trees up, get them moved out of the way before letting guests back in. Some evidence of that we saw today over at Disney's Animal Kingdom. You can see that some trees got pretty bent out of shape. Perhaps most concerning from the outset was we heard that there was damage to the Liberty Tree at the Magic Kingdom, which is a historical, very special tree at Walt Disney World with some amazing history and significance. It lost some branches, but the tree itself is hanging in there just fine. The damage is pretty minor, I'd say, overall. You can see that some flags at the parks, like this Mickey flag that I believe is near the entrance to the Transportation and Ticket Center heading to the Magic Kingdom, it got all ripped up, but for the most part, I'd say Disney got out of Hurricane Milton a little better than they got out of Hurricane Irma, where with Hurricane Irma, I definitely recall more major trees that were, the roots were sticking out of the ground. Here it seemed more like we were looking at a lot of snapped branches, just things of that nature. Neighborhoods near Disney, though, they did see trees completely collapse. So everyone, that is Hurricane Milton and specifically its effects on the Walt Disney World Resort in Orlando, Florida. It does look like some of the other theme parks in the area suffered some similar tree damage. And of course, you have the construction site over in Orlando where Universal's building a new park. And it does look like they had some trees sort of go lopsided over there, but it definitely could have been a lot worse at the Orlando theme parks based on the forecast we had. And in areas less lucky than Walt Disney World, it was much worse. There are still homes over by the Gulf that are flooded or filled with sand that blew their way. Also, the tornado situation that you had, that was horrible in South Florida on Wednesday. So our prayers are with everyone who was affected by Hurricane Milton down in Florida. Here's hoping that that was curtains for hurricanes making landfall in the Gulf area, because getting a double whammy like this was no fun at all. I hope you guys are all doing well. Thank you so much for watching. This is Brayden. Have a magical day.